The warships are there to send a signal that the United States is prepared to go all the way. I think that's an important message from the Americans. And at the end of the day, if they are attempting to apply pressure, they have to show visible signs that there's a credible, legitimate threat to military intervention. And so the deployment of all of these assets is really designed to reinforce this pressurization on the political and military elite within Venezuela. For the Americans, this is a long march. I mean, this is essentially a persistent pressurization campaign designed to create the kind of fractures or, um, you know, force some type of transition, negotiated transition from Maduro and maybe a few others that are part of the hardcore political elite. I mean, that's what this is. I don't think that the United States thinks it's going to happen swiftly. I think that Maduro is attempting to dig in. For Maduro, it's survival at this stage. I mean, there's not a whole lot of options for him if he leaves, the seat he's in now. The saying in Latin America is you either go in the ground, in jail, or in exile, right? And so that's the fate of dictators in Latin America historically. And so Maduro is fighting for survival. I think he's given off some signaling that he thinks that the United States is bluffing, that he's probably going to continue to call that bluff. And unless the Americans invade in a conventional military path, then we're looking for negotiations. We're looking for some type of palace coup in which the Venezuelan military seizes power and then forces a transition in some structured way that may be a combination of democratic forces and remnants of the existing government. That's one path. Another path is some type of political elite fracture that negotiates a pathway out from Maduro. Maybe that's into exile into Russia, who knows? But that would then bring someone from the current government up to the presidency and then work with democratic forces over the next year to 18 months to put new elections on the board and then begin that slow transition back to democracy. I think that the bigger challenge is a like a very quick rupture in change could make it problematic for the United States in the day after scenario planning, right? And so I think that ideally for the United States, it's a slower pressurization that leads to some type of negotiated or palace coup that stabilizes Venezuela in the day after, and then begins to enact the kinds of reforms needed to restore democracy, purge institutions that have been already gutted and placed with loyalists, and begin that process of redefining governing institutions under the democratic rules of the game. I don't think that the United States wants to have some type of conventional military invasion on the ground. I think that would be the worst case scenario for the Americans because that might pit the U.S. military, the U.S. Marines, up against Venezuelan soldiers, which are completely unmatched. I mean, the Venezuelan military is depleted. Its military wares are ill prepared to face the sophistication of the United States military. And so I don't think the Venezuelan military wants to be in that position, and I don't think the Americans want to do that because that means the day after planning becomes much more contentious because now you have a scenario where you fought Venezuelan military members, violence has erupted, lethality in some cases, and I think that could be really challenging for the United States. So the United States doesn't want to have to do that. Could the United States do some type of special operation that goes in and picks Maduro up and brings him back, to the United States and he stands trial and so forth? I think that is a possible scenario also. I don't think that also is a likely scenario. I think the most likely scenario is that change in Venezuela happens within, and that comes from the military in a palace coup or some negotiated transition with the political elite, something that stops short of the Americans having to go in and be forceful outside of pressurization from outside the country. I mean, a lot of people used to say he'd go to Cuba, but I think that would be a tough one because if he went to Cuba, Cuba's probably next on Secretary Rubio's list of regime change. So he might find himself kind of continuing to jump if he goes to Cuba. So I don't think anywhere in this hemisphere makes a lot of sense. I think it would be somewhere like Russia or Turkey. Again, I don't see China, but it's possible. I don't see Iran, which are close allies of Maduro. It would probably be somewhere, maybe a flat next to Assad in in Russia might be the best case scenario because I think that's where there has been some history of alignment between Russia and Venezuela under Maduro. So, I mean, those are probably options. Again, I don't think those are ideal, which is why Maduro is probably going to, hold off as long as possible. And here's an interesting part because the political elite and the military elite have to make a very calculated, timely decision here. If someone from the military breaks, let's say a palace coup begins to manifest, and the regime doesn't fall, then those military leaders are essentially done, right? They're going to jail, if not worse. And so that means they jumped too early. The regime didn't fall, and those military officers are now, in a really bad position. If they wait too long and regime change happens, and they're not part of that regime change, then the same scenario, right? New democratic forces are not going to judge them well because they didn't help in manifesting the regime change. So that puts political elite and military elite in a very intense, suspicious environment, thinking a lot about timing, right? When is it too soon? When is it too late? When is it just right? If I am going to make that jump, because the writing is on the wall, right? So that's the really tough part about palace coups and political elite fracture is that everyone has equity in this, and it can turn south or really bad for everyone. And so they have to make a very timed, conscious decision to make that jump to one side or the other. But they are certainly military and political elite are certainly thinking about, what's going to happen to me? What do I have to do? What's next? When's the right time? How do I play this? Because the Americans don't look like they're going away. I mean, there could be a scenario in which Delcy Rodriguez, who's the number two, steps into the presidency. Maduro is transitioned out in some negotiated transition. And then, fast forward 18 months, there's an election and Democratic forces come back to power. So, I mean, that could be a very plausible scenario, in my opinion, in which the Americans don't have to commit military equity on the ground in Venezuela over a pronounced period of time. The Venezuelans deal with it. There's a plan back to democracy. And ultimately, you need someone to help with that transition. It's either going to be a structure of people or it's going to be individuals that ultimately help kind of bring the bridge together between democratic forces, opposition, and current government officials, because all of the institutions are led by, loyalists to the current government. So how do you then go that process of gutting those institutions in the most peaceful, and efficient way possible to get back to thriving democratic institutions as soon as possible? I think that the seizing of oil tankers is a very important move. In fact, I mean, much of the regime is so the argument is that the regime's ability to survive is predicated on oil revenues and revenues from illicit trafficking activities, right? I mean, that fills the gap to some degree. Oil has largely been one of the biggest sources of revenue for the government, because of the um, mismanagement of PDVSA and the loss of oil productivity that's challenged some economic elements over time. But certainly, oil becomes incredibly important, and it also becomes important for some of its allies like Cuba and China, that get oil in bargaining scenarios or pennies on the dollar. And so, I think oil becomes really important. So for the Americans to seize oil, that's essentially cutting off a really important lifeline to the Venezuelan government, because ultimately they still need to survive, right? And so this is choking them from an economic perspective, to go along with sort of the pressurization of the military element.